Just another moment. Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Again, my name is Anthony Brancaccio. Today, we're going to be talking about the effects of the COVID-19 virus, illness, disease, and its effects on aviation, specifically general aviation, private aviation. During our presentation, as I said, please use our chat feature in the lower right-hand corner. That will allow you to post questions that we will be going over at the end of the presentation. Presentation is going to be about 45 to 50 minutes. Little about me. I am the operations manager and customer success manager for our market intelligence division here within Argus International that houses the TRAQPak suite of products. That would be TRAQPak Pro, TRAQPak FBO, and TRAQPak Fleet. From TRAQPak, we are able to build custom reports as well as data feeds. Argus is well known for our safety audits, software solutions, and consulting services. Recently, Argus was acquired by SGS, which is very well known globally as being the world's leading inspection, verification, and testing, as well as certification company. We have laboratories all over the world. Argus is going to complement what SGS does and vice versa very well. Today, our webinar will be presented by Travis Kuhn. Travis is our Vice President of Market Intelligence. Travis has been with Argus for the past 11 years. Travis, as a good side note here, Travis writes the year in review as well as the mid-year reports, which are very popular, and he also writes and forecasts the monthly year activity reports that a lot of people enjoy getting and reviewing. Travis, I am going to go ahead and kick it on over to you.
All right, thank you, Anthony, and thank you for that warm introduction. First, let me start with everybody and say we hope that you're all safe and well. This is certainly an unusual time that we live in, which is why we're here today. Second, I want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day today and out of your schedule to sit here with us for the next 45 minutes. And I really do think you're going to walk away from this looking from the lens that we're going to show you what we're seeing with flight activity here in North America and around the world. And we'll give you some information, some actionable information, and I think you're going to walk away very pleased. Real quick about me, as you can see on the screen, what do you most likely care to know about me? I've been in aviation for the last 14 years. All but 3 of those years I've spent in our market intelligence division here at Argus, specifically working on the historical flight data analysis and prediction and forecasting within our division. I am a licensed pilot. I hold an airline transport pilot certificate. One thing, if I'm going to be honest with everybody, that bothers me on the screen, it says I have 3,500 flight hours. I'm actually 46 shy of 4,000, but in an effort to be honest and not round up, we rounded down to the nearest factual milestone number that we could. So what are we going to talk about today? Let's go through in these next few slides here and define what we're going to talk about and let you know exactly what we want to show you. Our goal today is simple. We want to cover our industry in terms of flight activity and inform you on the impacts of COVID-19. We know we've seen the news. Everybody's seen the news. There are plenty of people in aviation on this today. You've seen the effects in your business. Now we're going to show you kind of what our industry actually is facing with some actual numbers today. We live in a data-driven world. Everybody knows it. Too often it's information overload. The biggest question that we get here at Argus and within the market intelligence division is, what does it mean? And specifically within our division, we are focused on the health of our industry in terms of flight activity. we're able to draw on our source, our data source at the FAA, our source within Europe, our global ADS-B feed around the world. And that allows us to not only educate those within our industry, we're able to report on a monthly basis, is activity up or down 1 or 2%, or in this case, we're talking drops of 30, 40, 50% or more. But we're also able to report that and tell you what it means, and then build on our years of predictive analytics to be able to tell you what we think is going to happen. And so we recognize that role is very important right now. We know that having actionable, quantifiable information is important in the industry. So we are, again, grateful that you've taken the time out of your day to let us be able to tell you what we're seeing through our lens. Two things I want to define real fast. Every slide we're going to go over today is referencing flight activity in North America, with the exception of one slide, which we'll cover on what's going on in Europe. And I will be sure to caveat that when we get there. And specifically, when we identify business aviation in North America, we break it up into aircraft and operational categories within our TRAQPak database. The aircraft categories you can see on the screen, I'm just going to go over them really quick. We do everything from a turboprop all the way up to a large cabin jet. Each one of the 4 segments you see on there is broken up into 2 subsegments. So for instance, small cabin has VLJs and light jets. Large cabin are large jets and super long range jets, which are your G5s, your Global Expresses. Everything is based on weight, with the exception of turboprops, which are going to be based on the engine, single and multi-engine. Our operational categories. Everybody knows business aviation is comprised of Part 91, Part 135, and fractional. I know that's probably not new information to you. What is important to know is how we classify that in our database, specifically around Part 135. We do not simply take all of the Part 135 operations that you'll see in North America and display them. We're focused more on the on-demand market, so our data specifically excludes 135 scheduled and 135 cargo operators. So as you're looking at our numbers, you're going to notice they differ probably from the FAA, and in that we're smaller. That's because we're trying to show the true on-demand business aviation market as it is. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into it. It truly is hard to believe how much our world has changed in just a matter of a few weeks. We approached February 2020 and frankly the start of 2020, and our forecasting and predictions model showed very strong growth throughout the first 6 months of 2020. When we were looking at it, we were seeing growth of anywhere from 2 to 4%. On a monthly range year over year throughout the first 6 months of 2020. And as we approached February, our forecasting model was showing a 3.1% year over year rise. And that does include the fact that we had leap year. So we did have an extra day. So February 2020, if all things were equal, still should have increased year over year in terms of flight activity. Ultimately, we saw traffic in February drop 0.2% year over year. Now, in a normal market, that is a number we don't like to see. With the numbers we're seeing right now, 0.2% really is statistically insignificant. If you look down at the bottom of the screen there, you can see our industry averages just shy of 260,000 flights per month. So 0.2% can be a big number if things are good. If things are really bad like they are right now, 0.2% really is not a significant number for us. As we move ahead through the month of March, this is where everything really started to change. We could see throughout the first 10 days of the month of March that activity had a little bit of a COVID-19 impact, but it wasn't significant. We only saw traffic drop about 5% year over year for the first 10 days of the month, and that's compared to March 2019. So some of the traffic was pulling down, but it wasn't related to what we were seeing going on around the world, and specifically like 2008 with the financial crisis. And we're going to talk about that in detail here in a few minutes. The turning point for business aviation was March 15th. That was the day across the US specifically when the individual states began to issue their stay-at-home orders and the extreme social distancing. This was the point at which our industry began to just take a nosedive, frankly. The first week following March 15th, we saw activity drop 37% week over week. That's frankly unheard of. And in this particular case, it didn't stop there. It actually continued to accelerate down throughout the rest of the month. Ultimately, we saw March 2020 activity drop 31.7% from March of 2019. And that's a significant number because if you think the first third of the month was off 5%, so the last 2/3 were off way worse than the 31% that we saw. Looking into April, we've had some chance to process some of the days so far in April. And what we're seeing, the first week in April, activity was down almost 74% from the same week in 2019. So looking at this data, there's no doubt we've entered this crisis. Activity has nosedived, and we are going to take a look at this in further detail here on these next few slides. As we look at this chart, one of the things we want to point out, percentages don't mean a whole lot if we cannot quantify them and tell you what these actual numbers are. So that's our sole goal here as we're looking at this. We want to give you perspective today, not only on this slide, but throughout the rest of this presentation on what we're actually seeing and what this means. So if you look at the orange bar on the left, this was business aviation activity February 1st, 2019 through April 10th, 2019. We can see we saw just shy of 590,000 business aviation flights. The blue line, unfortunately, represents that same time period this year, where activity produced about 440,000 business aviation flights in North America. Percentage-wise, that's about a 25% year-over-year drop. And what's even more interesting to think about is that we had an extra day in 2020 compared to 2019. So had all things been equal, the average day we see a little over 8,000 business aviation flights. We should have actually seen, if everything was equal, about 595 to 596,000 business aviation flights in 2020. And unfortunately, we came up well short of that. To add some more perspective to this and what we're truly seeing in our industry, our database, our TRAQPak database, houses data back to January of 2007. And if we look at data on a monthly basis, the worst month that we housed in our database prior to COVID-19 was February of 2009, which was, as most people remember, the bottom of the Great Recession and financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. That was the point at which the Dow reached its lowest close, was also the lowest point for flight activity. In that month, we recorded about 195,000 business aviation flights. Unfortunately, March 2020 just broke that record. We actually saw 182,000 business aviation flights in North America, and that's down from the 234,000 that we saw in February. Unfortunately, April 2020 right now is currently on track for about 80,000 business aviation flights in North America. So again, a recurring theme we're going to see today. This drawdown has been swift, and it has truly been unlike anything we've ever seen before. On this next slide, what we're going to do is we want to take a look at individual day activity to let you get a better understanding of what we're seeing on a daily basis now compared to what is normal. So we're going to focus on the right side of the screen first, and we'll reference back to the left side as we go along. But on the right side, you're going to see two boxes. The box on the left is showing us the bottom 10 days of flight activity for February through April of 2019. The right side is showing us the present day bottom 10 from February through April of 2020. Some things to notice if we look at 2019. The first thing you're going to see is the worst day we saw in 2019 saw about 5,400 business aviation flights. The other thing that's important when we look at the days in 2019, every single one of those dates listed on there was a Saturday or Sunday. That's important because business aviation has its ebb and flow throughout the week. Business normally occurs Monday through Friday. Those are the busier days. In fact, if we look at the left side of the screen, that's exactly what it tells us. These are the daily averages throughout 2019 based on the day of the week. We can see our lowest days are Saturday and Sunday. So that's what happened in 2019. The other thing that's worth pointing out as we look at the left side of the screen, the busiest day of the week, notoriously in business aviation, is Thursday. And in fact, last year we were an average of one flight shy of reaching 10,000 flights per day, which would have been a record. It already was a record, and activity up until this point had been growing at phenomenal rates. So 10,000 flights per day is very, very impressive number. It's not something that we see all that often, and the fact that Thursday almost averaged that last year was very good. If we move over to 2020, to put things in put things in perspective of what we're seeing, the worst day we saw was April 5th, at least to this point, and it was about 1,700 flights. We've seen a handful of days that have oscillated right around 2,000 flights, 2,500 flights, and we'll get into that in a little more detail as we go. But one of the things we have noticed here, to put this into a full perspective, as we look at all of these days of the week, on the left side, we have just weekend days. On the right side, every day of the week is featured except a Friday. And unfortunately, that means a Thursday as well, Thursday, April 9th of 2020. That particular day, activity was off about 75% from what's considered to be normal. And to add even one more perspective to what we're seeing in these numbers today, 2019, if we take the entire calendar year, the worst day of the year for flight activity, which is notoriously the same day every year, it's Christmas Day, as you can see on the top of the slide there, we saw 3,167 flights. Unfortunately, so far in 2020, and this is all centered around the COVID-19 days, we've already seen 19 days in this time period that were worse than the low of Christmas Day last year. All right, this is the one slide I mentioned that we were going to deviate from North American activity. We're going to take a quick look into what we're seeing in Europe. So our TRAQPak database houses the European flight activity, and we have data on that market back to 2017. So it's a relatively newer market for us over the last few years, but it's one that we've studied, and we're starting to understand a little bit more about the seasonal and cyclical demand we see over there. One of the things that's worth pointing out right away is if you look at this chart, you might think that activity has been declining in Europe since July. That's not the case. Activity over there typically follows a normal seasonality. It will peak in July, August, somewhere in there. In this case, over the last couple of years, it's been July, and then it's going to do a slow drop all the way through February before starting to pick back up again in March. We see something similar in the US, but we will cover that in more detail here in a minute. As you can see, looking at the orange line, that was last year. That's exactly what they did. Just a nice, slow, steady seasonal decline into February, and then it started to pick back up in March. For the last 9 months, well, 8 months, looking at this graph, we were doing the exact same thing. In fact, December, January, and February had tracked better from the previous year than what we had seen. Unfortunately, with the outbreak of COVID-19 in Europe, we can see that March did the exact opposite. In fact, it was a hard downfall of about 30%. And Europe's activity compared to the US has been almost identical in terms of percentage drop. We deal in larger numbers here in the US, but percentages have been the same. They saw about a 30% drop in year-over-year activity in March, whereas in the US and North America, we saw about a 31% drop. In Europe, we also saw that it was uniform across the board. No specific aircraft type was immune. They all were right about 30% drop in year-over-year activity from turboprops all the way up to super long-range jets. And while we do not forecast activity in Europe, looking at the data, looking at understanding of it, the market, we're anticipating that European activity is going to be down somewhere in the 80th percentile for the month of April. And beyond that, right now, with how fast information is changing, it's just a question of what May looks like. But April certainly looked like it's going to be down somewhere in the 80th percent. All right. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most common questions we get is, what does it all mean? The second most common question we've been getting during the COVID-19 crisis has been centered around, are we going back to 2008? Is this 2008? And I am of the firm belief that the answer is no. And I'm going to spend these next few slides not just saying that, but telling you why. We'll see some similarities, and we'll talk about that. But how we entered these, everybody knows is different, and we're going to see what the data tells us about this difference. So, as we look at this chart here, the orange line is plotting the Dow Jones Industrial Average from January of 2008 to July of 2009. The blue line is plotting business aviation flight activity in North America for that same time period. There's one thing to caveat. If you look at the chart, we can all clearly see that the bottom in terms of the monthly close for the Dow Jones and business aviation flight activity was February 2009. The actual true bottom for the Dow Jones Industrial Average was March 6th of 2009. So it occurred in the month of March, but it rocketed back up and so did its monthly close number. So that's why it's not fully reflected, but the monthly close bottom was February of 2009. So what do we know when we look at this chart? Well, there's a couple of things that stand out. First of all, if we consider the stock market and what's currently happening now versus what happened in 2008, if you look at 2008, it lost almost half of its value in just a matter of about 10 to 12 months. Business aviation did not see that same percentage drop. We saw activity peak around 282,000 flights of March of 2008, and then the bottom of February 2009 was at 195,000. It took essentially 11 months for flight activity to drop 30% in North America. That is a very important number because in 1 month in 2020, from February to March, flight activity dropped 22%. And if we consider where April is currently heading, the difference from April to February is on pace to be 64%. So more than double the drop that we saw in the Great Recession in 2008, and in literally 1/6 of the time. So the drop has been rapid, and there is no doubt that we are in a different time than what we saw in 2008. And that certainly leads, and the data seems to indicate that the recovery is also going to be different, but we'll talk about that more in a second. So how does activity correspond to the Dow present day? So this, as you can see, is the last 15 months of flight activity in North America versus last 15 months of activity on the Dow Jones. A couple things to point out as you look at the blue line, which represents flight activity. I mentioned we were talking about Europe, the seasonality of flight activity. We see something similar here in the US. First glance might indicate that activity has been shrinking since October, but that's simply not the case. One thing to point out, October 2019 was the busiest month in terms of flight activity that we had seen in North America since the Great Recession. So it was our highest month. And every year, typically October is the busiest month on the calendar. What happens at that point is we enter this same cycle, same 12-month cycle every year. Activity will then go into what we call a holiday and winter lull from November through February, culminating in the bottom in February, which is normal since we only have a 28-day month in terms of activity. There just aren't as many days to record as many flights. And then what we typically see is activity will increase fairly substantially from February to March. In fact, if you look at the left side of the graph, you can see that in 2019, it was a substantial month-over-month gain of almost about 10%. And that is relatively normal from February to March. What we've also can see is what was happening with the Dow during the same time period. The Dow was kind of floating around right about the 28,000 mark, even reached the 29,000 mark right around the beginning of the year, and then it started its downward trend. So it was not by any means starting a downward trend in October like we had seen and like we were seeing in flight activity. So it again points to the seasonality of the industry. One quick sidebar for October of why October in our analysis appears to indicate that October is the busiest day of the month. If we look at the calendar here in the US, October is the only month in the US that has all 6 professional sports leagues that are in season at that time, whether some are wrapping up or some are just beginning. There's a lot of private jet demand that evolves around that. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason, as we're going to see in a minute, the southern region of the United States is actually the most robust region in terms of flight activity. And that particular region is seeing its best weather right around that time of the year as the summer thunderstorms are winding down and we're transitioning to fall to winter. Most of the weather, not just in that region, but around the US is better. So it's better flying weather overall. And then one of the last important factors as to why we typically see a rise in October is that it's the only 31-day month on the calendar with no holiday impact. And I say that with a slight caveat. Halloween has a slight impact, but not nearly what a normal what we call a holiday impact will be. We'll see activity drop very, very small, but it's essentially a 31-day month with 31 traditional days for business aviation flying, and we really don't see that on the calendar anywhere else. So that all attributes to why October is typically one of the busier months of the year. So one thing to point out here as we look at this, we talked about how activity had dropped about 30% year over year back in 2008. what we can see here is that activity from March 2020, looking back to October 2019, activity was only down about 34%. The other thing that is important to note with that is Wall Street's first day for COVID impact activity was February 24th. Flight activity, if we all recall from the previous couple slides, did not pull back until March 15th. So at present, if you look at this chart on the outside, you might be able to argue there's a correlation on the right side. If you break it down in the individual daily activity, it's simply not there. If we go back to 2008, what was happening on Wall Street, because it was a financial crisis when we entered it, flight activity was literally mirroring what was happening on Wall Street. When it was down, flight activity was down. What we're seeing now, we're seeing wild, volatile swings in the industry, and we're not seeing that in flight activity. So we're going to see in a minute, flight activity has just been flat, right around 2,000 to 2,500 flights per day. It's not responding to what's happening on Wall Street, and the drawdown was literally tied to what happened in COVID cases, which we're going to see here in just a second. So, as promised, here's a graph some of you may have seen. It's on our website right now, and it's updating daily. But this is a look at what appears to be impacting flight activity and the direct correlation between the increase in COVID-19 cases and the drawdown in flight activity. So as we look at this chart, again, remember, it was February 24th when the Dow started sinking. We can see on the left side of the graph in blue there's some peaks and valleys. Those are normal business aviation, how activity breaks out during the week, the valley being Saturday and Sunday, the peak being Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So that is normal. If you go right to the middle of the month, right around March 15th, you'll see it goes into its weekend valley and it never comes back out. In fact, it just starts accelerating, and that's where we talked about that dramatic drop in the first week following March 15th. And then as you head down throughout the rest of the month, one good sign in flight activity is that it's not getting worse. We hit our bottom right around March 28th, and now it's April 21st, and we're seeing activity pretty much do what it's been doing for the last 3 weeks. It's not getting better. It's not getting worse. We're seeing around 2,000 to 2,500 flights per day. And to understand what that means for our industry, even in a recession, even if this becomes a full-blown financial crisis, the amount of lift that's available, the amount of movement, it does not support 2,500 flights per day. Our industry will have to rebound somewhere. Does it go back up to 10,000 flights per day on a Thursday? Probably not. But it's 2,000 flights per day is simply not enough demand as these measures start to be lifted and business returns. So there is no doubt activity is going to come back. What it looks like, not fully clear, but we'll talk about that as we get a little bit closer, as we go a bit further here throughout our presentation. Another area we wanted to look at as we dove into this data, we wanted to give you an understanding of what we're seeing in the airport environment and some of the specific dynamics throughout our industry. So as we look here, what we did with this particular chart is we took the top 25 airports in March of 2020, and we compared them to what they saw in terms of activity in March of 2019. No surprise here in North America, Teterboro is king. In 2019, we saw a little over 6,000 flights. Unfortunately, in 2020, we saw just a little over 4,000 flights. In fact, as we look at this chart with these 25 airports, the unfortunate thing to it is that every single one of them was down year over year in terms of flight activity. Another stat with this, 3 airports actually saw activity drops of at least 1,000 flights year over year. And those 3 airports, not surprisingly, Teterboro is one of them. The other 2 were Houston Hobby and Las Vegas McCarran. And in fact, if we look at the bottom of the screen here, we can see that Las Vegas, in terms of percentage, saw the largest year-over-year drop at 46.1%. I wish I could say they were the only airport that saw a drop in the 40th percentile year-over-year, but there were actually 6 airports. And those 6 airports in order were Las Vegas, John Wayne, Orange County, San Jose, Austin, Chicago Midway, and Houston Hobby. So what's interesting is you look at that, it's not defined to one area. As we expected, this impact has been across the entire U.S. Every single one of those airports, you plot them on a map, is all over the place. There's nothing in the East Coast, particularly on that, but we can see the impact of what was happening in Teterboro as far as a total number of operations drop. One bright spot on this is if you look at the 23rd airport on the chart, excuse me, Sarasota, you can see that activity was down about 9.2% year over year. So it was the smallest year over year drop. Total operations dropped a little over about 120 flights. So it wasn't all bad in some areas, but unfortunately, some areas also saw almost half of their normal activity drop in a given year. Another slide here that's very interesting to us that we've seen is the changing industry dynamics. If we look at the two pie charts here, the pie chart on the left represents the normal breakdown of operations on a monthly basis for business aviation. And historically, what we've seen is that Part 91 really makes up about 50% of the total industry operations. Part 135, right about 35, 36%, and the remaining 14% is going to be fractional activity. What we've seen in the COVID-19 environment has been a change. We've actually seen Part 91, we can call it a change, but 48%, 50%, it's still almost half the pie. But what has been interesting is fractional. About a third of their normal volume has shrank during this. They're down to about 9% of the total pie, whereas all of the gains have gone in the Part 135 market. And frankly, that seems to go right in line with what we're reading about on the news with extreme social distancing. If anybody does need to move and they have the ability to do it, they're going to be moving on a private chartered aircraft as opposed to going on a publicly available commercial airliner. So it's not entirely surprising that Part 135 has increased a little bit. It's a little surprising on the fractional side. And if we look at this chart, I'll talk about it when we get to our forecasting section. I think in the short term, this probably remains about what we're going to see. Long term, I fully expect, given the volume of aircraft that exist in the fractional scope, that it will grow back its piece of the pie. How 135 shakes out in terms of the rest of the industry, specifically as it relates to 91, does it get those 2 percentage points it took, or does it give them back? That'll be interesting to see as we go forward. But it's definitely had an impact in the way operations are breaking out on a daily basis. All right, so the next few slides are going to show how the industry has impacted across the U.S., specifically on a regional and geographic basis. And these slides are going to be very important because they're going to give us the areas we need to focus on for a recovery. One perhaps bright spot in our data is, as we mentioned, activity in March was down about 31% year over year. But in the U.S., the average drop across the states for March was only 23%. Which points to a significant and expected drop in international operations. But it also seems to indicate what we've thought all along, which is as this restart does happen, it's going to be almost purely domestic driven. And it's going to be a very long time before we see international operations resume. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So what are we seeing on this slide? What you're seeing are the March volume numbers for the 8 FAA regions as they cover the US. They're broken down in colors, and the total number of flights they saw in the month of March is listed there. Some points of interest that you'll want to take off this slide. The busiest region typically in the US is the Southeast region down there where Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas are. We saw a little over 48,000 flights in the month of March. Typically the lightest region in terms of flight activity is the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts. We saw just shy of 4,600 flights that month. To put that into perspective of what's normal, if we go to the bottom left of the screen, you can see what the monthly percentage drop was in terms of activity. And it's important to note this. Every single region saw at least a 20% drop, which is right in line with that 23% that we just talked about. What is interesting here is focusing on the recovery. If we consider that the coast, the East Coast and the West Coast, specifically New York, California, Washington, where they're having a little bit more difficulty than some of the other areas of the country, if we assume that their activity is going to be suppressed for some time, looking at this this map of the U.S. gives us an idea of where we can expect activity to rebound and where the most important areas are. And there are 3 that stand out to me. The Southeast region, the Southwest region where Texas is located, and then the Great Lakes region up there in blue. You can see there's a significant volume of flight activity in those regions. And the more we can get those regions open up, the better. And specifically, as we look at those regions, 3 of the top 5 states in terms of flight activity in 2019 are located there, and those 3 states represented 21% of all departures in the US in 2019. So if we get those states back online, we're going to be in better shape sooner rather than later. The other thing about those 3 regions that indicates there's growth potential there and volume demand is that the Southwest and Great Lakes regions saw the largest monthly decline in terms of percentage of flight activity. So that's good. That means that we have volume, we have the potential that exists. The other good sign on those numbers is that the Southern region saw the smallest month-over-month decline, which is also good because it's the busiest, most robust region. So although it lost a lot of activity, if we had lost 26%, we'd be seeing an even bigger drop in terms of total flights. So that's a somewhat good sign in the Southern region. Moving to the next slide, as I mentioned, we talk about the individual breakdown of states. There are a lot of numbers on this slide. So what we're going to do is just give you a quick overview of what it all means. These are the total number of departures in each of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia in 2019. What do you need to know and what are the points of emphasis? Well, it goes back to what I was just talking about with those regions. The top 5 states, if you look over to the left side of the screen in that little box, in order were California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey, and Georgia. It's worth pointing out New Jersey is tied heavily to New York. 75% of the operations in New Jersey in 2019 were related to Teterboro Airport. So that airport being directly tied to New York will have an impact on the operations in New Jersey. All 5 of those states represented 1/3 of all departures in the US in 2019. If we remove California and New York out of that, that leaves those 3 states that I had referenced on the previous slide, which are Texas, Florida, and Georgia. Those 3 states accounted for 21% of all the departures, or basically 1 out of every 5 departures in the US in 2019 were in those 3 states. So there's no doubt as we look at this, we understand the dynamics, we think about where the epicenter is in the US. The quicker we get some combination of all 5 of those states back up and running, the better it is going to be for our industry in terms of operations. I mean, we can look basically in the center of the country and see 280,000 operations out of Texas, and then just think about all the other states that Texas would hit coming out of there. So those states are going to be key and states we need to watch, markets we need to watch in the recovery here over these next few weeks and months. Another slide to take a look at here, when we put this together, we were actually expecting to see more changes than we did. As I look at this particular breakdown, what are we showing you here? Well, every year we put out our annual report, as Anthony mentioned at the start, and what we see in that report is usually every year the top aircraft types do not change. So on the left, we're showing you the 2019 results. We give you our 8 aircraft categories, and then we give you the top aircraft type in each category, and then the number of flights that aircraft type flew for the calendar year. What we did is we went through and looked at the COVID-19 environment and said, has anything changed? Well, surprisingly, other than the expected volume of flight change, the only category that changed was the very light jet. The Citation Mustang dethroned the Phenom 100. So there wasn't much of a change on the high level scale in terms of that. But there were, as we dug into the data, some other changes that were interesting in terms of just what we're seeing in the actual drops in aircraft. So if we look at the G5, which is the top super long range jet category aircraft, saw just a little shy of 50,000 flights in 2019. The average G5 on a normal day in North America, there's about 170 departures in the US. What we've seen lately, we've been averaging about 27 G5 departures per day. The King Air 200, which saw about 180,000 flights in 2019, normally we see about 430 departures per day. Lately, we've been averaging about 170 departures per day. And one of the most shocking individual numbers that I have seen as I've looked through this data, we track a handful of metrics on a daily basis as we're looking through our data, and we look at a handful of aircraft types. One of those aircraft types is the Falcon 2000. We had a day in April where if you think about the amount of movements, the amount of aircraft we're used to seeing in North America, but we had a Sunday in April where we had 7 Falcon 2000 departures across the entire US zone, only 7 departures. So just putting into perspective the drawdown that we're seeing. All right, so we've talked about what's been happening and what we've seen. Now we're to my favorite part of the presentation, which is predictions and forecasting. Where do we think things are going? So if we think about all the factors that influence our industry, there are some that have a bigger impact, obviously, and some that have a smaller impact. I firmly believe that our recovery looks different than 2008 and 2009. And frankly, I don't think that's a very bold statement to make. Given how fast and rapid activity is drawn down, there's almost no way it's not going to make some type of V-shaped recovery, just given the size of the economy here in the US. Once even parts of it start to come back, activity is going to come back. When it comes to forecasting in today's environment, it's a bit of a challenge. Frankly, we've been doing this for a little over 7 years, and every method we've used prior to this point, which has been fairly consistent, has been thrown out the window because we're in a dramatically different environment for forecasting and prediction. So what we have seen, what we have been able to predict based off our activity, we've looked at the slow drawdown in 2008. We've looked at the rapid drawdown that we're seeing in 2020. We've looked at similarities, we've looked at differences, and we've tried to identify, based off what we know, where is activity going. So what we can say is this. We can see in our industry that April is currently on pace for a 68% decline, and I really don't see it changing much than that. If anything, I hate to say it, but I think it will get a little worse. I don't necessarily think it gets better at this point. May is a wild card. When we went through and did our forecast for May, we're starting to see signs that the US is going to start looking opening on a state-by-state basis. If it does that, we can expect that activity with that will increase somewhat. What the exact number is, it depends on how the states open and how many of them and what time in the month that they actually opened. For our forecast, we pretty much wrote off the first half of the month and kept it about the same environment that we're seeing. And then we brought the second half of the month back on, and not at full scale. The overall best we see on an individual day in our forecast is around 70% of what would be considered normal towards the end of May. That brings us to a May forecast of a 42% year-over-year decline. And unfortunately, it's more than 42%, because if we look at what our original forecast was in a normal environment, we were expecting to be up 1, 2, 3 percentage points in May. So we're actually down about 45% from where we should be for the month of May. How does this break out across some of the other parts of the industry, 91, 135 fractional? Well, all indications are that Part 91 is going to hold right in line with what our industry is doing. So the percentage gain or drop in that particular segment is going to pretty much mimic what's happening in the industry. I do expect that Part 135 operations, at least in the short term, are going to outpace gains that we'll see in the industry, just given what will probably be a higher demand in a social distancing environment. I also expect that fractional activity, at least in the short term, in the very short term, will probably fare worse than the industry, just based off what we're seeing, and given some of the fleet sizes and the logistics of getting all that restarted for those companies. But either way, I do expect private aviation demand is going to surge ahead of airline demand. Business aviation is an agile industry. It wasn't that long ago that charter flights were booked 3-4 months out. Now, with changes in technology, most charter companies are responding to flights within 48 hours. So it's not going to take much or a significant amount of lead time for the industry to begin to respond once demand comes back. And that positions business aviation well and positions us well for a recovery. A quick review of what we've looked at and a few key points to drive home here on the very end. 2009 versus now, as we talked about it, they're different. It started as a financial crisis in 2009. This started as a pandemic. Does not mean we're not moving towards a financial crisis, but it means that they're different. And therefore, the recovery is no doubt going to be different. Do I think our recovery probably tracks closer to the stock market? I do. Did everything leading up to this point track close to it? No, it didn't. It tracked closer to COVID-19 cases, and that's what we've seen. As far as the changing dynamics go, as I just mentioned, we've seen that change in 91, 135 and fractional activity. I expect in the short term, again, it stays around those lines where Part 135 kind of outpaces a little bit, fractional lags. But as we get in probably a 3 to 6 month time frame, I expect that to start evening out and going back to normal, assuming we're not still in this extreme social distancing environment that we're in. The key months and markets for us to watch out for in our industry, as I mentioned, October. October is king in terms of flight activity in the US. At this point, given the drop we've seen, given the impact we've seen, I think it's safe to say there's little chance activity is going to increase year over year in the month of October. But the closer we can get that month to normal, the better things are going to be. And one thing that might impact that in a positive way will be the election. The election usually does have an increase in business aviation operations. We're in an election year, so that might help bolster activity as we get closer into October and trying to make up from some of the losses that we've seen previously. Key markets for us to watch out for, I go back to those 5 states I referenced: California, Texas, Florida, New Jersey, and Georgia. I think those 5 states are as key as it comes for our industry in this recovery. So if sooner those 5 states or some combination of those 5 states come online, the better it is going to be for business aviation. And then, as I mentioned, with domestic versus international expectations, I do think most of the demand return is domestic based. There will obviously be some international travel. There always has been. There always will be. We live in a global world. But the bulk of that international travel is going to most likely be on hold for the foreseeable future until countries around the world get a grip on what's going on with the COVID-19 crisis, and confidence, frankly, returns, and business confidence returns. So I certainly expect any rebound we see here in the U.S. is going to be more domestically driven as opposed to internationally driven. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Mr. Anthony Brancaccio, who's going to let you know where you can find some current information on our website, as well as more information if you so choose. Anthony?
Excellent. Thank you, Travis. I really appreciate that. I think our guests here found it to be very interesting as well. Before I get to the website and some other aspects here, first thing we're going to do is go over some of the poll results and some of the questions. So the first question here: has the current coronavirus situation had an impact on your organization's revenue yet? And the number one answer: it has decreased substantially, and that's unfortunate, but certainly understandable. And that was at 51%. It has decreased somewhat. Was the next one at 30%. What are you hoping to learn today? The first one was COVID-19's impact on total flight activity, and I think we covered that pretty well. Third question: which statement best describes your current feelings? Number one is being prepared and well informed is fundamental at this moment. That was at 72%. Next one was, I'm sure we will come out stronger. I hope that is indeed the case. 3, would you be interested in a custom report with data specific to your region or industry segment? Overwhelmingly at 72%, people said yes, and that's great to know. Last question: has the current coronavirus situation had an impact on your organization's revenue yet? Looks like we answered that one already. I'm sorry, that was a repeat. That was my error. So a couple of questions that came up as you were giving the presentation, Travis, was what areas are we talking about? What areas are we covering? So just wanted to be clear. I did put it in the chat, but if people weren't watching, the data is for North America, and what we are considering North America is the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. And you could see a lot of the maps there were specific to US because US is the driving factor here within North America. So That is where most of our data is. We do have European data as well. Later this year, we are going to be going and I should say plugging in more global information, but that is going to be later in the year. That's not current right now, so I want our audience to know that. But that is something that's coming. We do have European data right now, but for this specific report, it is North American. So we're going to get into some of the questions here. That was some that I had seen in the chat. Some of the questions are, is there any subsegments, charters or fractional, or utilization types, recreational versus business, that have been more resilient in the current downturn, Travis? Do you have that information? Do you have an idea?
Well, unfortunately, the drawdown's been pretty much industry-wide. There really hasn't been any particular segment or company or type of activity that has been immune here. What we have seen, as I mentioned, that changing industry dynamic, Part 135 activity has picked up a bigger percentage of the pie, but their total flight activity is still, down well over 2/3. So they're picking up more of the activity on a daily basis, but across the industry, all activity has been down and down pretty much consistently between 60 and 70%.
Okay, excellent. Next question came from James Neely here, and I see this as the Fed's as the Fed back to work phases progress, 1 to 3, I believe, phases. Will Argus be requiring or recommending crew virus testing? So that James, is not something that really falls into our division, our department, which is market intelligence. That falls into one of the other divisions that we have. So I can't answer that, and I don't want to give you a speculation. So we have your contact information. I believe we captured that. We're going to pass that on to the appropriate department and find out if there's any information that we can give you as a response. So we will answer that question for you from one of our other departments. But that is a good question. Thank you for that. Another question here is, have you modeled the impact of oil price for Texas and other oil states?
We have not, but given the news that we've seen over the last few days, for the first time in history, we've seen a negative oil price. I'm certain that's going to impact Texas and that surrounding Southwest region. What the impact is, I simply don't know. One of the challenges to really understand the financial impact here is that activity is so suppressed right now due to those social distancing measures, stay-at-home orders. It's really hard to know exactly what any financial impact is. I'm certain one is out there, and I'm certain that one exists, and that Texas will see some of this as a result of the oil crisis. But the other thing that drives this oil crisis is that there's no demand right now. So as demand comes back, in theory, that oil price, while I'm no market expert, should start to stabilize as well. So everything we're seeing right now is almost upside down. I would still expect that Texas and its surrounding regions will come back, at least in the short term, due to all the business operations that have been put on hold. Long term, I think if oil stays where it is, then we're really going to start to see an impact on that. But I don't think short-term resumption in operations are going to be really impacted.
Okay, all right. A few more questions here, Travis. Because you believe most demand return is domestic, do you expect that the result in faster recovery will be for turboprop, small and mid-jet categories, and less for large cabin?
That's a great question. I don't want to take the easy way out and say it's going to be mostly across the board. I do expect that. I will say, though, I think some of the bigger gains are going to be in the smaller aircraft cabins, just given the domestic range of those aircraft. I do think that the G5s, Global Expresses, BBJs, those types of aircraft will probably be a little more suppressed, or they'll be flying, if anything, just much shorter stage length. So if we think about in terms of operations, they might remain the same in domestic. Their total flight hours and flight hour billable flight hours probably does drop. And I think it drops higher on the higher end of the market as opposed to the lower end. So we're thinking in terms of billable hours. Yes, I do think the lower end of the market recovers before the top end of the market.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Travis, I'm going to just point people here to our slide that we have. Everybody, that slide is going to take you to the business aviation activity tool that we have, that we created. It's an interactive tool. You can select filters. So go ahead and make a copy of that if you can. We're going to move to the last couple of slides. So going here, what you're seeing is we have the ability for flight tracking information, custom reports, and data feeds. So a lot of your businesses are unique, different from others. It could be a fuel network, it could be an FBO network or a charter operator. You could have a list of customers that you are trying to find out what is going on with them, certain tail numbers. So we can create custom reports for you based off of criteria that you're interested in, and customer lists as well. So anything that you need from us, please look at us as being a partner or a resource for you in this time. But Travis, I think that is all of the questions. Let me just double check here. One last question was, in a normal environment, do you have an estimate of what portion of traffic is discretionary, recreational, sports related, et cetera, versus non-discretionary?
Unfortunately, I don't have a hard number on that. I wish I did. It's one of the ones we've tried to do research on. It's a challenging number to get because we don't get the individual mission-specific data on an aircraft. We just know when it moved and where it moved, and so that allows us to drive the market data. But we do not know each individual mission, so unfortunately, I can't answer that question as well as I'd like to.
All right, excellent. Well, at this point, we've come in for the landing, and we're now taxiing to the gate. I appreciate everybody's time here to be our guests this afternoon. I hope you all do stay safe and healthy, and hopefully we will get through this sooner rather than later. If you have any questions after this, please feel free to reach out to me. I will be more than happy to help answer your questions, pass them on to Travis if we need to get Travis involved. But again, thank you for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.